You know, there's something about the rain in Appalachia that changes everything. The way it falls between the ancient mountains, how it pools in the hollows where generations of secrets have been buried. I've lived here my whole life, and I thought I understood these hills, these communities, these people. But some nights, when the rain starts drumming against my window and the mist rolls down from the ridges, I realize how little any of us really know about what lurks beneath the surface of our ordinary lives. Tonight, I need to share something with you. 8 stories. 8 nights when the rain revealed things that should have stayed hidden. These aren't fairy tales or urban legends passed down through generations. These are confessions, real experiences from real people who stumbled upon powers so terrifying, so intimate, that they changed everything about how they see the world. Each story involves an object. Something simple, something you might overlook at a yard sale or find in your grandmother's attic. But here's what I've learned. In Appalachia, nothing is ever just what it seems. The mountains hold memories, and sometimes those memories attach themselves to the most innocent things, waiting for the right person, the right moment, the right rainy night to reveal their true nature. So I have to ask you this. What if the thing you're holding right now, the object sitting closest to you as you listen to my voice, what if it's been waiting? What if it has a power you never suspected? What if everything you thought you knew about your safe, ordinary world is about to change? Before we begin this journey together, I need your help. If these stories move you, if they make you question what's real, please hit that like button. Subscribe to help Dr. Bonechill reach 10,000 subscribers. Because the more people who hear these stories, the more we can understand what we're truly dealing with. And please comment below. Tell me about your own experiences, your own encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Because after tonight, you'll realize you're not alone in this. The first story comes from a man named David, a teacher who moved to a small Appalachian town 3 years ago. He thought he was escaping the chaos of city life. Instead, he found something far more disturbing than anything he'd left behind. I moved to Cedar Hollow in September looking for peace. After 15 years teaching in Atlanta, dealing with overcrowded classrooms and endless administrative battles, I wanted simplicity. The kind of quiet life where your biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win the county fair again. The rental house was perfect. A small 2-bedroom place on Maple Street with a front porch that overlooked the valley and mountains that seemed to stretch forever. The landlord, an elderly man named Earl, handed me the keys with a warning about the basement flooding during heavy rains. "Nothing serious," he said. "Just keep an eye on it." For the first month, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. I taught 4th grade at the local elementary school, graded papers on my porch while watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets instead of sirens. It felt like I'd finally found where I belonged. Then October arrived, and with it came the rain. It started on a Tuesday night, a gentle pattering against the windows that actually helped me sleep. But by Thursday, it had intensified into something more persistent, more demanding. The sound seemed to echo through the house in ways that didn't make sense, like the rain was falling inside the walls themselves. That's when I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar. Earl had mentioned the flooding, so I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs to check for water damage. The basement was dry but cluttered with the remnants of previous tenants. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture covered in dusty sheets, the usual forgotten artifacts of family life. In the corner, sitting on a small wooden table, was a music box. It was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. Dark mahogany wood with intricate carvings of vines and flowers, about the size of a jewelry box but clearly meant for something more significant. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of detailed work you don't see anymore. When I lifted the lid, a tiny ballerina in a faded pink tutu began to spin slowly, and the sweetest melody filled the air. I recognized the tune immediately. Für Elise, but played in a delicate, haunting arrangement that seemed to carry more weight than Beethoven ever intended. The sound was hypnotic, drawing me deeper into its gentle rhythm until I realized I'd been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, just listening. The next morning, I brought the music box upstairs and placed it on my dresser. I told myself it was because the melody was so beautiful, but truthfully, something about leaving it in that basement felt wrong, like abandoning something that needed care. Over the following days, I found myself opening the box more frequently. While preparing lessons, I'd lift the lid and let the music play. During dinner, I'd wind it up and listen as I ate. Before bed, the gentle melody became part of my routine, helping me relax after long days at school. But then I started noticing changes. It began with my students. Emma, a shy girl who usually sat in the back corner and rarely spoke, began participating more in class discussions. At first, I was pleased. Good teachers celebrate breakthrough moments like these. But Emma's participation had an unusual quality. She would speak in this dreamy, distant voice, and her answers, while correct, seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 9-year-old understanding. When we discussed the water cycle, Emma described rain as the mountain's way of crying for what? It's lost. When we studied local history, she talked about the whispers in the walls of old houses with such specificity that I felt a chill down my spine. Other students began changing too. Marcus, typically hyperactive and disruptive, became eerily calm and focused. Sarah started drawing pictures during math class, intricate sketches of forests and streams that showed artistic ability far beyond her grade level. The entire classroom dynamic shifted, becoming more subdued, more attentive. At first, I attributed these changes to good teaching and natural development. But during parent conferences, several families expressed concern. Emma's mother mentioned that her daughter had been sleepwalking, standing in their backyard in the middle of the night humming a tune she couldn't identify. Marcus's father worried that his son seemed different, more withdrawn at home, spending hours staring out the window toward the mountains. It was then that I realized they were all humming the same tune. The melody from the music box. I'd never played it at school. The music box remained on my dresser at home, yet somehow that haunting arrangement of Für Elise had embedded itself in my students' minds. They hummed it during independent work. Time tapped its rhythm with their pencils and moved to its tempo when walking through the hallways. The more I observed this phenomenon, the more unsettled I became. I stopped opening the music box, hoping the influence would fade, but the melody seemed to have taken on a life of its own, spreading through the school like a contagion of sound. One evening, during a particularly heavy rainstorm, I decided to return the music box to the basement. As I carried it downstairs, the lid somehow opened on its own and the familiar melody began to play. But this time, the music sounded different, sadder, more desperate, like a plea. I set it back on the wooden table and turned to leave, but something made me stop. In the dim light of my flashlight, I noticed something I'd missed before. Carved into the bottom of the table, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, were initials and a date. M.H. 1952. The next day, I asked around town about the history of my rental house. Mrs. Patterson at the general store, who seemed to know everyone and everything in Cedar Hollow, told me about the Holloway family who'd lived there for decades. Tragic story, she said, shaking her head. They had a daughter, Mary. Sweet little thing, loved to dance, took lessons in the city, was quite talented from what I heard. She paused, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Mary died in 1952, some kind of accident. During one of those terrible October storms. The family never really recovered. They moved away soon after, and the house has been a rental ever since. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that melody playing softly in the distance. Not from the basement. The music box remained silent down there. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the rain, drifting through the walls, settling into the very foundation of the house. I found myself walking to the basement without consciously deciding to do so. The music box sat exactly where I'd left it, but as I approached, the lid opened by itself, and Mary began to dance. But she wasn't alone anymore. In the weak beam of my flashlight, I could see them. Translucent figures of children, moving to the haunting melody. Their their faces peaceful but somehow hollow. My students, Emma, Marcus, Sarah, and others I recognized from school. They danced in perfect synchronization with the tiny ballerina, their movements graceful and unnatural. The melody grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just playing for them. It was calling to me. My feet began to move against my will, stepping in time with the music. The rhythm felt familiar, comfortable, like something I'd always known. As I danced, I understood what was happening. Mary Holloway hadn't died in that storm in 1952. She'd been transformed, her spirit bound to the music box, her longing for companionship growing stronger with each passing year. The music box wasn't just playing melodies, it was collecting souls, drawing children to dance forever in Mary's eternal performance. I tried to stop moving, to break free from the melody's hold, but the music had become part of my heartbeat, my breathing, my very existence. The other figures smiled at me welcomingly, their eyes reflecting the same peaceful emptiness I could feel settling into my own thoughts. Then, somehow, I managed to knock over the music box. The melody stopped abruptly, and the ghostly figures vanished. I found myself alone in the basement, shaking and disoriented, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I moved out the next morning. I told Earl I had a family emergency, threw my belongings into boxes, and drove back to Atlanta without looking back. I never returned to Cedar Hollow, never said goodbye to my students, never explained my sudden departure. But sometimes, on rainy nights when the sound echoes just right, I still hear that melody. And I know that somewhere in that basement, Mary Holloway is still dancing, still waiting, still calling for children to join her eternal performance. The worst part? Last week, I received a letter from the Cedar Hollow Elementary School. Several of my former students have gone missing during recent rainstorms. The letter asked if I had any insights into their behavior before I left. I threw the letter away without responding, because the truth is, I know exactly where they are. They're dancing with Mary, moving to a melody that will never end, in a performance that will last forever. And on nights like tonight, when the rain falls just right, part of me wants to drive back to Cedar Hollow, back to that house on Maple Street, back to that basement where the music never really stops. Because once you've heard Mary's song, really heard it, you never stop dancing. Story 2. The Photograph. My name is Thomas, and I need to tell you about the photograph that destroyed my family. Not physically, you understand. We're all still breathing, still going through the motions of our daily lives. But what we were, what we meant to each other, that died the moment I brought that cursed thing into our home. I'm a contractor by trade, specializing in home renovations in the smaller towns scattered throughout these Appalachian valleys. It's honest work, and it keeps me close to my wife Linda, and our twin daughters Amy and Beth, who just turned 12 last spring. We live in Millfield, a town so small that everyone knows everyone and your reputation is everything. Last November, I was hired to renovate the old Brennan house on Oak Ridge Road. The place had been empty for nearly 20 years ever since old Mrs. Brennan passed away and her children moved to the cities. It was a beautiful Victorian, the kind with wraparound porches and intricate woodwork that they don't build anymore. But decades of neglect had taken their toll. The work was extensive. New plumbing, electrical updates, and structural repairs. I spent weeks in that house stripping away layers of wallpaper and paint, revealing the bones of something that had once been magnificent. It was during the third week, while cleaning out a storage room in the attic, that I found it. The photograph was tucked inside an old jewelry box wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch. It was a family portrait, black and white, probably from the 1940s based on the clothing and styling. A man and woman stood behind 3 children, their faces serious in that formal way people used to pose for pictures. The craftsmanship was remarkable, printed on heavy paper with that rich contrast you only get from genuine silver gelatin prints. But it was their eyes that caught my attention. All 5 family members had the most striking, intense gaze I'd ever seen in a photograph. Not the usual stiff formality of old portraits, but something alive, something that seemed to follow you as you moved. I found myself staring at it for longer than I intended, drawn into those piercing stares that seemed to hold secrets. I should have left it in the attic. Should have included it with the other personal items I was setting aside for the Brennan children to sort through. Instead, I slipped it into my toolbox. I told myself it was because of the exceptional quality that Linda would appreciate the artistry. She'd studied photography in college before the girls were born, and I thought she'd find it interesting from a technical perspective. That evening, I brought it home and showed it to my family over dinner. Linda was indeed impressed by the photographic technique, and the girls were fascinated by the old-fashioned clothing and formal poses. We decided to display it on our mantel, next to our own family photos. "They look so serious," Amy observed, tilting her head as she studied the image. "People didn't smile in old pictures," Beth added, always the one to show off her knowledge. "It was because the exposure times were so long." But Linda frowned slightly as she examined it more closely. "There's something about their expressions," she said quietly. "It's not just serious, it's almost expectant, like they're waiting for something." That night I woke to the sound of whispering. It was barely audible, just at the edge of hearing, but persistent enough to pull me from sleep. I lay still, listening, trying to determine if it was coming from outside or within the house. Whispers seemed to drift through the walls, carrying words I couldn't quite make out, but that felt somehow familiar. I checked on the girls first. Both were sleeping peacefully in their beds, though Amy was murmuring something in her sleep. When I leaned closer to listen, I realized she was speaking in a voice that didn't sound quite like hers. Older, more formal, with an accent I couldn't place. The whispering continued for several nights, always just loud enough to wake me, but too quiet to understand. During the day, I noticed subtle changes in my family's behavior. The girls, who usually chattered constantly, became more subdued, spending long periods staring at the photograph on the mantel. Linda grew distant, distracted, often stopping, mid-conversation, as if listening to something only she could hear. It was during the second week that I noticed the photograph had changed, not dramatically. The 5 figures were still there, still posed in the same formal arrangement, but their positions had shifted slightly. The father's hand, which had rested on the mother's shoulder, now hung at his side. One of the children, a boy who had been standing behind his siblings, was now clearly visible between them. When I mentioned this to Linda, she looked at me with concern. "Thomas, photographs don't change. Maybe you're just remembering it wrong." But I knew what I'd seen. I'd studied that image carefully when I first found it, memorizing every detail. The positions were different, subtly, but undeniably different. The changes accelerated after that. Each morning, the family in the photograph had moved slightly, as if someone was taking a series of pictures and switching them out while we slept. The father stepped forward. The mother's expression became more stern. The children moved closer together, their eyes growing more intense with each shift. My own family's behavior became increasingly disturbing. Amy and Beth began speaking in unison, finishing each other's thoughts in a way that went beyond the usual twin connection. They would stand in front of the photograph for hours, perfectly still, as if posing for an invisible camera. Linda started dressing differently, styling her hair in a severe bun that reminded me of the woman in the photograph. She began preparing elaborate formal meals that none of us had requested, setting the table with our good china, and insisting we sit up straight, speak only when spoken to, and maintain proper posture throughout dinner. "We must present ourselves appropriately," she would say in a voice that sounded eerily like her own, but with subtle differences in tone and inflection. "Appearance matters. Behavior matters. We are being observed." The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I began to make out phrases. "Join us. Complete the portrait. Take your place." The voices were multiple, layered, speaking in harmony with words that seemed to come from the photograph itself. One rainy Thursday night in December, I woke to find my entire family standing in the living room, arranged in front of the fireplace, in the exact same positions as the people in the photograph. Linda stood tall and straight, her hands clasped in front of her. The twins flanked her on either side, their expressions unnaturally serious and composed. They were perfectly still, like living statues staring directly at me with eyes that reflected the firelight but held no warmth, no recognition, no trace of the people I loved. "We're ready now," Linda said in that strange, formal voice. "The portrait can be completed." I looked at the photograph on the mantel and gasped. The 5 original figures were gone. The frame now contained an empty scene, the same background, the same formal setting, but no people, as if they had somehow stepped out of the picture and into my living room. "No," I whispered, backing toward the door. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But Amy and Beth spoke in perfect unison, their voices eerily calm. "The photograph needs a family, Daddy. We're going to be the new portrait. We're going to stay forever." I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran from my own house, from my own family, into the rainy December night. I drove to my brother's place 2 towns over and spent the night on his couch, unable to explain what I'd witnessed, knowing it sounded like the ravings of a madman. When I returned the next morning, everything appeared normal. Linda was making breakfast, humming softly to herself. The girls were getting ready for school, chattering about their plans for the weekend. The photograph on the mantel showed the original family again, posed exactly as I remembered from that first day, but they weren't quite the same people anymore. Linda's smiles didn't reach her eyes. The girls' laughter sounded hollow, performed, rather than genuine. And sometimes when they didn't think I was watching, they would slip back into those formal poses, standing perfectly still with that same expectant expression I'd seen in the photograph. The worst part is the new pictures we've taken as a family since then. In every single one, no matter how casual the setting or how spontaneous the moment, we look exactly like the people in that antique photograph. Same serious expressions, same formal posture, same intense stares that seem to follow you wherever you go. I tried to get rid of the photograph. I threw it in the garbage, but it reappeared on the mantel the next morning. I burned it in the backyard, but Linda somehow had another copy, perfectly intact, ready to hang back in its place. "You can't destroy us," she told me that night, speaking in that voice that was hers but wasn't. "We're part of the family now. We've always been part of the family. I still live in the same house, still go through the motions of being a husband and father. But I know the truth. My real family is gone, replaced by something that wears their faces and speaks with their voices but serves a different purpose entirely. They're waiting for the next family to find the photograph. Because that's what it does, you see. It moves, from house to house, family to family, collecting souls to fill its eternal portrait. Each family becomes part of its history, bound forever to pose for a picture that will never be finished, never be perfect, never be complete. And sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and the house is quiet, I catch glimpses of all the other families who came before us. They're there in the photograph, layered beneath the surface like multiple exposures on the same piece of film. Dozens of families, maybe hundreds, all trapped in that formal pose, all waiting for their turn to step out of the frame and claim the next unsuspecting household. The photograph is still there on our mantel, still changing positions when no one's looking, still whispering its invitations in the dark, and I'm still here, waiting for my turn to step completely into the frame, to become just another face in that eternal family portrait that grows larger and hungrier with each passing year. Sometimes I wonder if this is what happened to the original Brennan family all those years ago. If they found the photograph somewhere else, brought it home, and slowly disappeared into its endless composition. But mostly, I just try not to look directly at it anymore, because every time I do, I see myself getting a little more formal, a little more serious, a little more ready to take my final position in a photograph that will outlast us all. Story 3. The Garden Gnome. They say you can tell a lot about a person by their garden. If that's true, then what I'm about to tell you should have been my first warning about who I was becoming. My name is Robert, and I used to be the kind of man who mowed his lawn every Saturday, edged his flower beds with military precision, and took pride in having the most manicured yard in Willowbrook Heights. I moved to this subdivision 5 years ago after my divorce. It was one of those newer developments carved into the Appalachian foothills, where every house looked similar, but the lots backed up against dense forest that stretched for miles. Perfect for a man who wanted order in the front and wilderness in the back. A controlled balance between civilization and nature. The neighborhood was exactly what I needed. Quiet streets, responsible neighbors, well-maintained properties. The kind of place where children rode bicycles safely and families gathered for block parties. I threw myself into yard work with the dedication of a man trying to rebuild his life one flower bed at a time. My garden became my sanctuary. I spent weekends planting, weeding, fertilizing, creating geometric patterns with my flower beds that would have made a landscape architect proud. The neighbors often complimented my work, and I took genuine satisfaction in maintaining something beautiful, something that reflected order and care. It was during a rainy Saturday in early March that I decided to add some decorative elements to the garden. The local garden center was having a clearance sale on outdoor ornaments, and I thought a few tasteful pieces might add character to my precisely planned landscape. That's where I found him. The garden gnome sat alone on a back shelf, marked down to nearly nothing. He wasn't like the cheerful, colorful gnomes you typically see. This one was carved from what appeared to be genuine stone, weathered and aged, with intricate details that suggested real craftsmanship. His face was serious, almost stern, with deep-set eyes that seemed remarkably lifelike. He wore traditional gnome attire, pointed hat, belted tunic, sturdy boots, but everything about him suggested dignity rather than whimsy. The price tag read simply, "Estate sale, $5." I brought him home and placed him near my prize roses, thinking he would add a touch of old-world charm to the garden. He seemed to fit perfectly, as if he'd been waiting for that exact spot his entire existence. The first change I noticed was in my roses themselves. Within days of placing the gnome in the garden, my roses began blooming with an intensity I'd never seen before. The colors became more vibrant, the blooms larger and more abundant. The fragrance grew so rich and intoxicating that I found myself spending longer periods outside, just breathing in their perfume. But it wasn't just the roses. Every plant in my garden began to flourish with unnatural vigor. My tomatoes grew fat and perfect. My herbs became so aromatic that their scent carried through the entire neighborhood, and my lawn achieved a shade of green that bordered on supernatural. 3XD. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Patterson from next door commented that my garden looked like something from a magazine. Jim across the street asked what fertilizer I was using, joking that he needed some of that magic formula. Even the mailman started taking longer routes past my house, lingering to admire the increasingly spectacular display. I attributed it to beginner's luck and good soil conditions. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I would look out my bedroom window and see the garden gnome in the moonlight. Sometimes I could swear he had moved slightly from where I'd placed him. Just a few inches, never dramatically, but enough to make me question my memory. By May, my garden had become the talk of the neighborhood. People would walk by just to stare at the impossible beauty of my flowers, the perfect geometry of my vegetables, the flawless emerald carpet of my lawn. I began to take immense pride in their admiration, spending even more time tending to my plants, perfecting every detail. That's when I started noticing the changes in myself. It began with my hands. The constant gardening had always left them dirty and calloused, but now they seemed permanently stained with earth, no matter how thoroughly I scrubbed them. The stains weren't just on my palms and fingers, but seemed to go deeper, as if the soil had somehow become part of me. My sleep patterns changed too. I found myself waking before dawn with an irresistible urge to check on the garden, to walk among my plants in those quiet pre-sunrise hours when the dew was heavy and the air was thick with growing things. During these early morning walks, I would speak to my plants, encouraging them, praising their growth, promising them continued care. The garden gnome always seemed to be watching during these dawn visits. His stone eyes would catch the early light in ways that made them appear almost alive, almost aware. I began to feel as though he approved of my dedication, that he understood my commitment to creating something perfect. As summer progressed, my garden grew beyond anything that seemed natural or possible. My tomatoes reached the size of softballs, my corn stalks stretched 12 feet high, and my flowers bloomed in combinations of colors that shouldn't have existed in nature. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story. The county extension office sent someone to take soil samples, unable to explain the unprecedented growth. But with the garden's success came increasing isolation from the human world. I stopped accepting social invitations, stopped maintaining friendships, stopped participating in anything that took me away from my plants. My life narrowed to the boundaries of my property, and I was content with that limitation. The neighbors began to comment on my appearance. I'd lost weight, my skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and my hair had started thinning. But I felt stronger than ever, more connected to the earth, more attuned to the subtle needs of growing things. I could sense when a plant needed water, when soil required nutrients, when insects threatened the delicate balance I'd created. It was during a thunderstorm in late July that I finally understood what was happening. I was awakened by the sound of rain pelting against my windows with unusual force. Concerned about my garden, I went outside to check for damage despite the dangerous weather. The wind was fierce, bending trees and sending debris flying, but my garden remained perfectly still, as if protected by an invisible barrier. In the center of it all stood the garden gnome, completely motionless while chaos raged around him. But as lightning illuminated the scene, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The gnome wasn't just watching the garden anymore. He was controlling it. With each flash of lightning, I could see thin, root-like tendrils extending from his stone feet deep into the earth, connecting him to every plant, every flower, every blade of grass. The entire garden was part of him, an extension of his will, a living network under his command. And I realized with growing horror that I was part of that network too. The soil stains on my hands weren't just dirt. They were the same root-like connections, binding me to the garden, making me another component in whatever ancient magic animated the gnome. I could feel the pull of every plant, the needs and desires of growing things flowing through me like blood through veins. The gnome turned his head to look directly at me, and for the first time, I saw his stone features shift into what might have been a smile. "You have been an excellent gardener," he said, his voice like wind through leaves, like rain on soil, like the whisper of growing things in the dark. "The garden has never been more beautiful." I tried to step backward to break free from whatever force held me, but my feet had grown roots into the earth beneath me. Not metaphorically. Actual roots, pale and hungry, extending from my flesh into the soil, drawing nutrients and giving back something I couldn't identify. "Don't be afraid," the gnome continued, his ancient eyes reflecting depths I couldn't fathom. "You are becoming what you always wanted to be. Perfect, eternal, part of something greater than yourself." I could feel myself changing more rapidly. Now, my skin taking on a bark-like texture, my hair becoming more like moss than human keratin. But the strangest part was that I wasn't entirely unhappy about the transformation. The garden needed me. The plants depended on me. I was finally part of something that would last forever. The storm passed, and morning came with its usual routines. The neighbors emerged to assess the damage to their own properties, but my garden remained pristine, more beautiful than ever. They attributed it to good planning and superior landscaping. I still tend my garden every day. My roses still bloom with impossible beauty. My vegetables still grow to unnatural sizes, and my lawn still maintains that supernatural green perfection. The neighbors still compliment my work, though I notice they seem less comfortable approaching me directly than they used to be. Perhaps it's because I've become less recognizably human with each passing season. My skin has taken on the texture and color of tree bark. My hair has become a tangle of moss and small flowering vines, and my movements have slowed to match the patient rhythm of growing things. But I don't mind the changes. I understand now that I was always meant to be here, tending this garden, serving the ancient intelligence that dwells within that weathered stone gnome. He has been waiting for decades, maybe centuries, for someone dedicated enough to join his eternal cultivation project. Sometimes new people move into the neighborhood and they always comment on my remarkable garden. They ask for advice, for tips on how to achieve such spectacular results. I always tell them the same thing. It's all about finding the right decorative elements, the pieces that truly understand what a garden needs. And when they're ready, when they've demonstrated sufficient dedication to the art of growing things, I mention that the local garden center sometimes has interesting gnomes on clearance. Estate sales, you know. Amazing what treasures people leave behind. The garden gnome watches these conversations with what I've learned to recognize as approval. He's patient, ancient, and always ready to welcome another devoted gardener into our perfect, eternal landscape. After all, a garden this beautiful requires constant tending, and there's always room for one more set of helping hands. Even if those hands are no longer entirely human, they're still capable of creating something magnificent, something that will bloom forever in the shadow of the mountains, sustained by love and tended by those who have found their true calling in the soil. Story 4. The Wind Chimes. I never believed in omens until I brought those wind chimes home. My name is Michael, and I've spent most of my 43 years as a rational man. I'm an accountant, for God's sake. Numbers don't lie, spreadsheets don't, harbor dark secrets, and balance sheets reveal truth in black and white. At least that's what I thought before the music started. I live alone in a modest house on Birch Lane in Maple Grove, a quiet mountain community where the most exciting thing that usually happens is Mrs. Chen's cat getting stuck in the old oak tree. After my wife passed 2 years ago from cancer, I'd settled into a comfortable routine of work, television, and the occasional visit from my grown daughter Sarah, who lives 3 hours away in Charleston. The loneliness was manageable. I had my routines, my habits, my carefully structured life that kept the grief at bay. But the silence, that was harder to bear. The house felt too quiet without Ellen's laughter, without her humming while she cooked, without the gentle sounds of a life shared with someone you love. It was a gray October afternoon when I decided to visit the craft fair at the community center. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to get out of the house, to be around people without having to engage in meaningful conversation. The fair was the usual collection of homemade quilts, preserve jars, and wooden crafts that populate these mountain gatherings. That's where I saw her. An elderly woman sat at a corner booth filled with the most beautiful wind chimes I'd ever seen. They were handcrafted, each one unique, made from materials that caught the light in fascinating ways. Some incorporated smooth river stones, others featured pieces of colored glass that looked like captured rainbows. But it was the largest set that drew my attention. These wind chimes were made from what appeared to be antique silver, with tubes of varying lengths that promised rich, complex tones. Between the tubes hung small metallic discs engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. Not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something that felt ancient and meaningful. "They're beautiful," I told the woman, who looked up at me with eyes that seemed much younger than her weathered face. "They're more than beautiful," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "They're listeners. Each set is tuned to hear different things. This one," she gestured to the silver set that had captured my attention, "this one hears the voices of those who've passed on." I almost walked away then. I'm not a superstitious man, and the idea of communing with the dead struck me as either nonsense or something I wasn't ready to confront. But something about the way she said it, the absolute certainty in her voice, made me pause. "The voices of the dead?" I asked, trying to keep skepticism out of my tone. She nodded seriously. "When the wind is right, when the conditions are perfect, they sing the words that couldn't be spoken in life. Messages left unsaid, feelings left unexpressed, love that never found its voice." The rational part of my mind rejected this completely, but another part, the part that still ached for Ellen's voice, that would have given anything to hear her speak just one more time, found itself intrigued despite my better judgment. "How much?" I heard myself asking. "For you, $50. But understand, young man, once you hang these chimes, you must be prepared to listen. Not everyone is ready to hear what the dead have to say. I bought them anyway." I hung the wind chimes on my back porch that evening, in a spot where they would catch the mountain breezes, but not disturb the neighbors. They were heavier than I'd expected, and the silver tubes felt warm to the touch despite the cool October air. That first night they were silent. The breeze was gentle but persistent, yet the chimes remained perfectly still, as if waiting for something specific. Found myself checking on them every few hours, disappointed by their silence, but also, if I'm honest, somewhat relieved. The second night brought the first sounds. I was reading in my chair by the window when I heard it, a soft, melodic chiming that was nothing like typical wind chimes. These sounds had depth, complexity, almost like voices harmonizing in a language I couldn't understand. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, carrying emotional weight that made my chest tighten with unexpected feeling. I went outside to listen more closely, and the chiming grew more distinct. Within the musical tones, I began to hear something else. Whispers, soft voices speaking words just at the edge of comprehension. Ellen's voice was among them. I know how that sounds. I know the rational explanations, grief, wishful thinking, the mind's tendency to find patterns where none exist. But I also know what I heard. Her voice, as clear and warm as it had been in life, speaking my name with the same affection she'd always shown. "Michael," the wind chimes sang in Ellen's voice. "Michael, can you hear me?" I stood on that porch until dawn, listening to fragments of conversation that felt both impossible and absolutely real. Ellen spoke about things only she could know. Private jokes, shared memories, moments of intimacy that no one else had witnessed. But she wasn't alone. Other voices joined the melody, speaking in overlapping whispers that created a chorus of the departed. Some voices I recognized as neighbors who had passed away over the years. Others were strangers, speaking of lives and loves I knew nothing about. The chimes became my obsession. Every evening I would wait for the wind to rise and the voices to begin. Ellen spoke to me almost nightly, and I found myself answering her, having conversations that felt as natural as any we'd shared when she was alive. She told me she missed. She described what it was like where she was, not heaven or hell, but something in between, a place where souls gathered to watch over those they'd loved. She said she could see me struggling with loneliness, see me eating frozen dinners and falling asleep in my chair, and it broke her heart to watch me withdraw from life. "You need to start living again, Michael," she would tell me through the musical tones of the chimes. "I'm not really gone, but you're dying a little more each day, and that's not what I want for you." The conversations were a comfort, but they were also becoming something else. An addiction. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking my mail, stopped doing anything that might take me away from the porch when the wind was right for hearing voices. My daughter Sarah noticed during her monthly visit. She found me sitting outside, at 2 a.m, talking to apparently empty air, responding to voices she couldn't hear. "Dad, you're scaring me," she said, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "You look like you haven't slept in days. Are you feeling okay?" How could I explain that I was finally feeling better than I had in years? That Ellen and I were talking. Again, that the silence that had been killing me was finally broken. Sarah would think I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, but the alternative, returning to that crushing quiet, was unbearable. It was during the third week that the other voices began to grow stronger, more insistent. While Ellen remained gentle and loving, others in the chorus carried different messages. Some spoke of anger, of unfinished business, of lives cut short by violence or betrayal. Their voices added discordant notes to the previously beautiful melody. One voice in particular began to dominate the nightly conversations. A man who identified himself as James, who claimed to have lived in my house decades before I bought it. His story emerged in fragments over several nights, how he'd been murdered by his business partner, buried in the basement, his body never found, his killer never brought to justice. "You have to help me," James pleaded through the chimes. "You have to tell people what happened. You have to give me peace." But Ellen's voice grew weaker as James's grew stronger, as if there was only so much spiritual energy the chimes could channel, and the more desperate souls were crowding out the gentle ones. Michael, Ellen whispered faintly one rainy night. The chimes are dangerous. They're not just letting us speak to you. They're pulling us back, holding us here when we should be moving on. You have to... Her voice was cut off by James's angry shouting, demanding justice, demanding action, demanding that I contact the police about his murder. Other voices joined his. Victims of unsolved crimes, people who had died with grievances unresolved, souls who saw me as their chance for closure. The beautiful harmony of the dead became a cacophony of desperate pleas. I tried to stop listening, tried to go inside and ignore the increasingly frantic voices that rose from the chimes every night. But they had become impossibly loud, no longer requiring wind to activate them. They sang constantly now, a chorus of the dead that grew larger and more insistent with each passing day. My health began to deteriorate. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, wasn't living in any meaningful sense. I existed only to serve as a conduit for the voices of the dead, to listen to their complaints and demands and desperate pleas for help I couldn't provide. Sarah tried to intervene. She came to stay with me, bringing her husband and their young son, trying to pull me back into the world of the living. But I could barely hear them over the constant singing of the dead. It was my grandson who finally showed me the truth. 5-year-old Tommy was playing in the backyard when he stopped beneath the wind chimes and looked up with the clear, unfiltered perception that children possess. "Grandpa Mike," he said, tugging on my sleeve, "why are all those sad people trapped in your music thing?" I looked up at the chimes and saw what Tommy saw. Faces. Dozens of translucent faces pressed against the silver tubes like prisoners against the bars of a cell. Not speaking to me. Not trying to communicate with the living world, but trapped, bound to the chimes by whatever dark magic had created them. Ellen's face was among them, her expression not peaceful but anguished, her mouth moving in silent screams that the chimes transformed into beautiful melodies. The old woman at the craft fair had lied. The chimes didn't allow the dead to speak to the living. They captured souls, imprisoned them, forced them to sing for anyone willing to listen, preventing them from finding whatever peace awaited beyond life. I tried to take the chimes down that night, but they had become impossibly heavy, and touching them sent jolts of electric pain through my hands. The faces pressed against the metal grew more agitated when I attempted to free them, their silent screams becoming more desperate. "You can't remove us," James's voice explained through the melody. "We're part of the chimes now, and the chimes are part of you. You've been listening too long, Michael. Soon you'll join us, and then you'll sing forever too." I realized with growing horror that he was right. My reflection in the mirror showed the same translucent quality I'd seen in Tommy's description of the trapped souls. I was becoming part of the collection, another voice to add to the eternal chorus. But I still had a choice. That final night, I called Sarah and told her I loved her, told her to take Tommy and stay away from the house for a while. I apologized for being distant, for letting grief consume me, for choosing the voices of the dead over the love of the living. Then I took a sledgehammer to the wind chimes. The first blow released a sound like a scream made of music, a cry of anguish that seemed to shake the very mountains. The faces trapped in the metal became more visible, more desperate, reaching out as if I might be able to pull them free. The second blow cracked the largest tube, and I felt a piece of my soul tear away with it. Part of me was already bound to, the chimes already becoming part of their terrible symphony. The third blow shattered them completely. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no voices, no whispers from beyond the grave. Just the kind of quiet that had driven me to the craft fair in the first place. The emptiness that had made me vulnerable to false promises of communion with the dead. But in that silence, I heard something else. Ellen's voice, faint but free, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but that felt like forgiveness, like release, like a final goodbye spoken with love rather than desperation. The broken pieces of the chimes dissolved like mist, leaving only small puddles of silver that evaporated with the morning sun. The souls that had been trapped within them were finally free to move on to whatever comes after life, no longer bound to sing for the loneliness of the living. I still live alone in my house on Birch Lane. The silence is still difficult sometimes, and I still miss Ellen's voice more than words can express. But I've learned that the dead should rest in peace, not be forced to comfort the living with false promises of eternal conversation. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the mountain wind blows just right, I think I hear echoes of those trapped souls, finally free to sing their own songs rather than the melodies demanded by cursed silver and desperate grief. And I remember that love doesn't require voices to be real, doesn't need words to endure, and sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, even when holding on seems like the only way to survive the silence. Story 5. The Mason Jar. They say moonshine runs in the blood around these parts, and maybe that's true. My name is Daniel, and my family's been making corn liquor in these Appalachian hills for 5 generations. Not the romantic kind of moonshining you see in movies, but the hard, dangerous work of feeding families when legal jobs were scarce and the mountains didn't offer much else in the way of honest living. I never intended to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. I got my degree, worked in Asheville for a decade as a software engineer, lived a clean, modern life with health insurance and a 401k. But when Granddad passed last spring and left me, his property up on Blackberry Ridge, something pulled me back to the old ways. Maybe it was the smell of the mountain air, thick with the scent of wild herbs and ancient earth. Maybe it was the peace I found in the isolation, the way the modern world seemed to fall away when I walked through those woods where my ancestors had hidden their stills for over a century. Or maybe it was just the need to connect with something real, something that had substance and history and meaning beyond the digital realm I'd been living in. The cabin was exactly as Granddad had left it. Simple, functional, with a root cellar that stayed cool year-round, and a workshop where he'd practiced his craft. Most of his equipment was gone, sold off or destroyed years ago when he got too old to run the risks. But some things remained. Family things, personal things, including the mason jar. It sat on a shelf in the workshop, unremarkable except for its obvious age. The glass was thick and slightly green-tinted in the way of very old containers, and the metal lid bore the wear of decades of use. But it was the liquid inside that caught my attention. The jar was about half full of what appeared to be moonshine, crystal clear and pure-looking. A piece of masking tape on the side bore my grandfather's careful handwriting. Final batch, 1987, do not open. I'd never known Granddad to save his liquor. He was a practical man who made what he could sell and sold what he made. Keeping. A jar for 37 years seemed completely out of character. But there it was, sealed tight, carrying a warning that made no sense for a man who'd drunk moonshine like water his entire life. I left it alone for the first few weeks while I settled into mountain life. I had plenty to occupy my time. Repairing the cabin, clearing overgrown trails, learning to live without the constant connectivity I'd taken for granted in the city. The jar sat on its shelf, and I found my eyes drawn to it whenever I worked, in the shop. But I respected Granddad's warning. It was during my first attempt at making my own batch that curiosity finally got the better of me. I'd been following one of Granddad's recipes, carefully documented in a notebook he'd left behind. The process was more complex than I'd expected, requiring patience and precision that my modern lifestyle hadn't prepared me for. After several failed attempts that produced either weak swill or undrinkable poison, I was becoming frustrated with my inability to master what should have been my birthright. That's when I decided to open Granddad's final batch, thinking a taste might give me insight into what I was doing wrong. The moment I twisted off the lid, I knew something was different. The aroma that rose from the jar wasn't the harsh burning scent of typical moonshine. Instead, it carried notes I couldn't identify. Herbs and flowers, but also something deeper, earthier, like the smell of soil after rain or leaves decomposing in the forest. I poured a small amount into a glass, just enough to taste. The liquid was perfectly clear, almost luminous in the afternoon light filtering through the workshop windows. When I held it up to examine it more closely, I could swear I saw movement within the glass, like tiny currents flowing in patterns too complex to follow. The first sip was a revelation. It didn't burn like moonshine should. Instead, it warmed me from the inside out, spreading through my body with a gentleness that belied its appearance. But more than the physical sensation, it carried knowledge. As the liquid touched my tongue, I suddenly understood things about distillation that I'd been struggling with for weeks. The precise temperature controls, the timing of cuts, the subtle signs that indicated when a batch was ready. It was as if my grandfather's decades of experience were being transferred directly into my consciousness. I took another sip, and the knowledge deepened. I could see the entire process now, not just the mechanical steps, but the intuitive understanding that separated true craftsmen from mere followers of recipes. I understood how the phases of the moon affected fermentation, how different plants growing around the still could influence flavor, how the very mood of the distiller could impact the final product. But the knowledge came with something else. Memories that weren't my own. I saw my grandfather as a young man working by lamplight in hidden clearings, always listening for the sound of approaching revenuers. I felt his pride when a batch turned out perfect, his fear when neighbors were arrested, his determination to provide for his family despite the risks. And I saw others, men and women from generations past, all connected to this place, all working the same trade, all facing the same dangers and taking the same risks. Their memories flowed through the moonshine like an intoxicating river of family history. With each sip, I absorbed more, not just knowledge, but the actual experiences of those who had come before me. I lived through prohibition raids, felt the desperation of the Depression years when moonshine was the only thing that kept families fed, experienced the gradual decline of the trade as legal alternatives became available and the risks grew too great. But as the jar emptied, I began to understand why Granddad had sealed it away with such a stern warning. The moonshine wasn't just preserving knowledge and memories, it was preserving souls. Every person who had contributed to its creation, every distiller who had shared their techniques, every family member who had carried on the tradition, every ancestor who had perfected the craft, they were all trapped within that clear liquid, their essence bound to the very thing they had devoted their lives to mastering. I could feel them now, pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness, eager to live again through my hands, to practice their craft through my actions. They whispered instructions in voices that felt like my own thoughts, guided my movements, with the accumulated skill of a century of moonshining. Under their influence, I began to produce liquor of extraordinary quality. Each batch was perfect, carrying flavors and complexity that seemed impossible for someone with my limited experience. Word spread quickly through the mountain communities, and people began seeking out my product with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. But success came with a price I hadn't anticipated. The more I drank from that jar, the more I could feel myself disappearing. My own memories were being overwhelmed by the experiences of the dead, my personality subsumed by the collective will of generations of distillers who refused to let their craft die with them. I began to speak in phrases that belonged to my great-grandfather, moved with the careful precision that had characterized my great-great-uncle's work, thought with the accumulated wisdom of ancestors I'd never met, but whose knowledge now lived within me. My reflection in the mirror showed changes that went beyond the physical effects of mountain living. My eyes had taken on the distant look of someone seeing beyond the present moment, accessing memories from decades or centuries past. My hands moved with skills I'd never learned, performing complex procedures with the confidence of decades of experience. The worst part was that I didn't entirely mind the transformation. The knowledge was intoxicating, the sense of connection to my heritage more powerful than any drug. I was becoming the culmination of my family's legacy, the perfect distiller who could carry on traditions that might otherwise be lost forever. But I was also ceasing to be myself. It was during a thunderstorm in late November that I finally understood the full extent of what was happening. As rain pounded against the cabin roof and lightning illuminated the workshop, I found myself automatically beginning another batch, my hands moving through procedures I didn't consciously remember learning. But I wasn't alone. In the flickering light, I could see them, translucent figures standing around the still, watching with approval as I worked. My grandfather was there, but so were others, men and women from across the decades, all connected by their shared dedication to the craft, all bound to the moonshine that had consumed their lives and now preserved their souls. "You're doing well, boy," my grandfather said, his voice carrying the familiar authority I remembered from childhood. "The family tradition will live on through you." "But what about my life?" I asked, surprised to hear my own voice among the ghostly chorus. "What about who I was before?" "That person was just preparation," another voice answered, one I recognized as belonging to my great-grandfather. "Everything you were was leading to this moment, to becoming what we need you to be." I realized then that this had been planned all along. The inheritance of the property, the discovery of the jar, the irresistible pull to continue the family tradition, none of it had been coincidence. I had been chosen, groomed, prepared to serve as the vessel for their collective consciousness. The jar was nearly empty now, and with each drop I consumed, more of my individual identity dissolved into the ancestral collective. Soon I would be indistinguishable from them. Another voice in the chorus of the dead, another soul bound to the moonshine that had become our shared prison and purpose. But I still had a choice. That night, while the spirits watched and whispered their encouragement, I took the remaining moonshine and poured it onto the workshop floor. The liquid hissed and steamed as it hit the wood, and the ghostly figures around me began to scream in voices that sounded like wind through empty bottles. "You're destroying us," my grandfather cried. "You're ending the family legacy." "No," I replied, feeling more like myself than I had in months. "I'm freeing us." As the last drops of the supernatural moonshine soaked into the floorboards, the spirits began to fade. Some looked angry, others seemed relieved, but all of them were finally released from their binding to the earthly craft that had defined and ultimately consumed them. My grandfather was the last to go. As his form became translucent and began to dissolve, he looked at me with something that might have been pride mixed with sadness. "The knowledge will die with us," he said quietly. "No," I told him. "It'll live in the mountains, in the land, in the natural places where it belongs. But it won't be trapped anymore." I destroyed the still that night, broke apart the equipment that had served my family for generations, and scattered the pieces throughout the forest where they could rust and return to the earth. The workshop I left empty, a memorial to skills and traditions that had their time but shouldn't be preserved at the cost of human souls. I still live on Blackberry Ridge, but I've returned to my work in technology, connecting to the world through fiber optic cables rather than supernatural moonshine. The cabin is peaceful now, free from the whispers of the dead and the weight of inherited obligations. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I think I can smell the ghost of fermenting mash carried on the mountain wind. But it's a clean scent now, natural and untainted by the desperation of souls who couldn't let go of their earthly pursuits. The mason jar sits on my mantle, empty and harmless, a reminder that some family traditions are better honored in memory than in practice, and that knowledge, no matter how precious or hard-won, isn't worth preserving if it costs us our humanity in the process. The mountains keep their secrets now, and the dead are finally allowed to rest, their skills and wisdom return to the earth that taught them everything they ever needed to know. Story 6. The Rocking Chair. Some pieces of furniture carry the weight of the lives they've witnessed, and I should have recognized that burden the moment I saw her sitting in that rocking chair. My name is James, and I'm a hospice nurse who's spent the last 15 years helping people transition from this world to whatever comes next. I thought I understood death. Thought I'd seen every variation of how a soul prepares to leave its earthly body behind. I was wrong. I work primarily in the rural communities scattered throughout these Appalachian valleys, places where people still prefer to die at home, surrounded by family rather than in sterile hospital rooms. It's difficult work, emotionally demanding, but also deeply meaningful. There's something sacred about being present during those final moments, about offering comfort to both the dying and those they leave behind. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in late September. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, 87 years old, living alone in a farmhouse outside the small community of Pine Hollow. Her niece had contacted our service after Eleanor's doctor determined she had perhaps weeks rather than months remaining. Cancer, aggressive and too advanced for treatment, But Eleanor had refused hospitalization. She wants to die in her own home, the niece explained over the phone. In her own bed, in her own way. She's a proud woman, very independent. I think she'll like you. The Whitman farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dense forest before opening into a small clearing, dominated by a 2-story white house with green shutters. It had the well-maintained appearance of a place that had been loved for generations, with flower gardens that even in their autumn decline showed evidence of careful tending. Eleanor Whitman met me at the door despite her niece's protests that she should be resting. She was a small woman, bird-like in her frailty but carrying herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Her eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing as she evaluated me with the frank assessment of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "So you're the death nurse," she said without preamble, though her tone held no hostility. "I suppose Martha thinks I need looking after." "I'm here to help make you more comfortable," I replied, keeping my voice gentle but professional. "And to answer any questions you might have about what to expect." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, come in then. Mind you wipe your feet. I may be dying, but I still keep a clean house." The interior of the farmhouse was exactly what I'd expected from a woman like Eleanor. Everything was immaculate but lived in, decorated with the accumulated treasures of a long life well lived. Family photographs covered the mantel, handmade quilts draped the furniture, and the scent of baking bread filled the air despite her illness. But it was the rocking chair that immediately drew my attention. It sat in the corner of the living room, positioned to look out the large window that faced the mountains. The chair was clearly old, carved from what appeared to be cherry wood, that had darkened with age to a deep, rich brown. Every surface was covered with intricate designs, flowers, vines, and symbols that seemed to tell a story I couldn't quite decipher. But more than its obvious craftsmanship, the chair possessed a presence that was almost tangible. It seemed to radiate warmth and comfort, but also something deeper, something that spoke of countless hours of use, of lives lived and stories shared within its embrace. "That was my grandmother's chair," Eleanor said, noticing my attention. "And her grandmother's before that. Been in the family for over 150 years. Every woman in my line has done her dying in that chair." "It's beautiful," I said, meaning it. "The carving work is extraordinary. My great-great-grandfather made it for his wife when she was carrying their first child. Took him nearly 2 years to finish all the detail work. She rocked all 6 of their babies in that chair, and when her time came, she died in it too. Been the family death chair ever since." The way she said death chair was matter of fact, without the morbid fascination or fear that usually accompanied such statements. To Eleanor, it was simply a family tradition, a piece of furniture with a specific purpose that had been honored for generations. Over the following days, I visited Eleanor twice daily, monitoring her condition and managing her pain medication. She was a remarkable patient, stoic without being stubborn, accepting of her situation without surrendering her dignity or her interest in the world around her. We developed a routine. I would arrive in the morning to check her vitals and adjust her medications, and she would insist on making me coffee despite my protests that she should be conserving her energy. We would sit in her kitchen and she would tell me stories about her life, her family, the history of the valley where she'd lived her entire existence. But she never sat in the rocking chair. Every day I would see her glance at it with what I gradually recognized as longing mixed with apprehension. She would approach it sometimes, running her fingers along the carved armrests, but she always chose other seating when we talked or when she rested during the day. "Saving it for the right time," she explained, when I finally asked about her obvious avoidance of the chair. "When you sit in that chair to do your dying, you don't get back up. It's not something you do lightly or before you're ready." I'd worked with many patients who had specific beliefs about death and dying, but there was something about Eleanor's certainty regarding the chair that unsettled me. It wasn't superstition or folk belief. It was knowledge, spoken with the confidence of someone who had witnessed its truth repeatedly. As Eleanor's condition deteriorated, I began spending longer periods at the farmhouse. Her niece Martha visited daily, but Eleanor had specifically requested that professional care be provided by someone outside the family. "Don't want them remembering me as helpless," she explained. "Want their last memories to be of me as myself, not as what this disease is making me become." It was during my 3rd week of caring for Eleanor that I began to understand what she meant about the chair. I had arrived for my evening visit to find Eleanor weaker than usual, struggling with pain that her medications weren't adequately controlling. She was sitting at her kitchen table, but her eyes kept drifting to the rocking chair visible through the doorway. "It's calling to me," she said quietly. "Can you feel it? The way it pulls at you when you're ready?" I looked at the chair, trying to sense whatever Eleanor was experiencing. At first I felt nothing unusual, but as I continued to observe it, I began to notice something subtle. The chair seemed to be gently moving, rocking back and forth just barely, as if responding to some invisible presence. "Mrs. Whitman," I said carefully, "there's no one in that chair." She smiled, the expression both sad and peaceful. "Not yet, but she's waiting. My grandmother. She's been waiting for me my whole life, really. Waiting to help me make the crossing." I should have attributed this to the effects of her medication or the hallucinations that sometimes accompany end-stage illness. But there was something about the way Eleanor spoke, the absolute conviction in her voice, that made me pay closer attention to the chair. Over the following days, I began to observe it more carefully. The gentle rocking continued, sometimes barely perceptible, other times more pronounced. But more disturbing than the movement was the growing sense that the chair was indeed occupied by someone I couldn't see. I found myself glancing at it throughout my visits, expecting to catch a glimpse of whoever was causing the motion. Sometimes, particularly in the evening light that filtered through the window, I could almost see a shape in the chair, a translucent figure of an elderly woman, rocking patiently, waiting with infinite patience for Eleanor to join her. Eleanor's condition continued to decline, and with it came increasing references to the family members she claimed to see gathering around the chair. Her grandmother was always present, but others joined her as Eleanor grew weaker. Aunts and cousins, her mother and sister, all women who had died in that same chair, all waiting to welcome her into whatever came after life. "They're telling me it's almost time," Eleanor confided during what would prove to be one of our last conversations. "They say the crossing is easier when you're surrounded by family, when you're in the place where generations have made the journey before you." That night, Eleanor made her decision. I arrived for my morning visit to find her already seated in the rocking chair, dressed in her best dress with her hair carefully styled. She looked more peaceful than I'd seen her in weeks, though I could tell her physical condition had deteriorated significantly overnight. "Today's the day," she announced with certainty. "I can feel it. They're all here now, waiting for me." I should have tried to move her to her bed, should have made her more comfortable in a more conventional sense. But something about her absolute calm, her obvious readiness for what was coming, made me respect her choice. I sat with her throughout that day, monitoring her condition and managing her pain, but mostly just being present as she prepared for her final journey. The chair rocked gently throughout the day, sometimes from Eleanor's own movements, but often when she was perfectly still, as if moved by invisible hands. As evening approached, Eleanor's breathing became more labored, and I could see the signs that her time was very near. But rather than the fear or anxiety I often witnessed in dying patients, she seemed increasingly at peace, occasionally speaking to people I couldn't see, participating in conversations with family members who existed only in whatever realm she was preparing to enter. "They say you can see them too," she whispered during her final hour. "They say you have the gift, that you've always been able to sense when souls are ready to cross over." I looked around the room and realized with a shock that she was right. The space around the rocking chair was filled with translucent figures, women of various ages, all bearing family resemblances to Eleanor, all watching with expressions of love and welcome as she prepared to join them. Eleanor passed away just as the sun set behind the mountains, Her final breath released with a soft sigh that seemed to carry her spirit directly into the embrace of those who had been waiting. For just a moment I saw her clearly among them, young again, healthy, surrounded by the love of generations of family who had made this same journey in this same chair. Then they were gone, and I was alone with an empty rocking chair that had finally stopped moving. Martha arranged for the funeral, and I helped prepare Eleanor's body according to her wishes. But before I left the farmhouse for the final time, I found myself drawn back to the rocking chair. It sat silent and still now, but I could feel the accumulated weight of all the lives it had witnessed, all the deaths it had comforted, all the souls it had helped transition from one world to the next. This wasn't just furniture, it was a sacred object, a bridge between life and death that had been blessed by generations of faithful service. Martha appeared beside me as I stood contemplating the chair. She left instructions about it, she said quietly. She wants it to go to the next woman in the family who'll need it. My daughter, probably, though I hope that's many years from now. It's been passed down for generations, always to someone who needs its comfort, its help with the crossing. Eleanor said it knows when it's needed, knows how to help souls let go when their time comes. I left the farmhouse that evening with a deeper understanding of my own work, of the sacred nature of the transition I witness so often. Not every family has a chair like Eleanor's, blessed by generations of peaceful deaths and loving farewells. But every death I attend carries the same potential for grace, the same opportunity for souls to find peace in their final moments. Sometimes now, when I'm with patients who are struggling to let go, who are fighting the natural process of dying, I think about Eleanor's chair and the patient presence of those who wait to welcome us home. I tell them about the love that surrounds us in our final moments, about the family members who have gone before and are ready to help us make the crossing. And sometimes, if I'm very still and pay careful attention, I can see them too, the gathered, souls who wait with infinite patience and boundless love, ready to guide us from this world to whatever comes next. Whether we have a family rocking chair or just the comfort of knowing we don't make that final journey alone. The chair continues its work now in Martha's daughter's home, waiting patiently for the day when it will once again fulfill its sacred purpose, when another member of the Whitman family will need its comfort and the presence of those who have gone before. Because some traditions are too important to die, too sacred to abandon, too necessary to be lost even when the world changes around them. Death, after all, is the one experience that unites us all, and we all deserve to face it surrounded by love, whether visible or invisible, whether we understand it or simply trust in its presence. Story 7. The Quilt. There's something about handmade quilts that carries the essence of the women who stitch them, and I should have paid attention to the darkness I felt radiating from this particular one the moment I brought it home. My name is William, and I'm a history professor at the community college in Beckley, specializing in Appalachian folk traditions and material culture. I thought I understood the significance of quilts in mountain communities, but I never imagined how deeply personal history could be woven into fabric until it was too late. I'd been researching traditional quilting patterns for a book I was writing about domestic arts in 19th century Appalachia when I heard about the estate sale at the old Morrison place up on Devil's Fork Road. The Morrisons had been one of the founding families of the region, and their homestead had been in continuous family occupation for over 200 years, until the last heir died without children the previous winter. The house itself was a magnificent example of Appalachian architecture, with wide porches and hand-hewn log construction that had weathered countless storms. But it was the contents that drew my professional interest. Generations of family possessions that had never been dispersed, including what the estate sale advertisement described as extensive collection of antique textiles and quilts. I arrived, early on the first day of the sale, hoping to examine the quilts before serious collectors drove up the prices. The house was packed with browsers and dealers, but I made my way directly to the bedroom where the textiles were displayed. Most were typical examples of traditional patterns: wedding ring, log cabin, flying geese. Beautiful work, but nothing unusual for the region and period. But in the back corner of the room, hanging separately from the others, was a quilt that stopped me in my tracks. It was enormous, clearly intended for a large bed, worked in deep blues and blacks with touches of red that seemed to glow against the darker fabrics. The pattern was unlike anything I'd seen before, not geometric like most traditional designs, but representational, telling a story through carefully pieced images that formed a narrative when viewed as a whole. The central panel depicted a mountain valley rendered in fabric with surprising detail and accuracy. Surrounding this were border panels that showed scenes of daily life. Women working in gardens, children playing, men working in fields. But the longer I studied it, the more disturbing the images became. The figures in the quilt weren't celebrating life. They were depicting death. The women in the gardens were burying small bundles. The children weren't playing but lying still with their eyes closed. The men in the fields were digging graves. And throughout the entire composition, barely visible unless you looked closely, were tiny red stitches that looked disturbingly like blood. "That one's not for sale," a voice said behind me. I turned to see an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, with the kind of sharp eyes and direct manner that marked her as a mountain native. She was small and spare, dressed in the simple, practical clothing favored by women of her generation. "I'm sorry?" I said, confused by her statement. "The Morrison quilt. That one there. It's not part of the estate sale. Family decided to keep it." I looked around the room again, noting that every other textile had a price tag except the quilt I'd been examining. "Are you part of the Morrison family?" She shook her head. "Name's Agnes Caldwell. I live down the road a piece. Known the Morrisons my whole life. That quilt has a history that goes with it, and some things shouldn't be sold to strangers." Her tone suggested she was willing to elaborate, and my academic curiosity was fully aroused. "What kind of history?" Agnes glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then moved closer to the quilt. "Sarah Morrison made this quilt back in 1847, during the fever outbreak that killed near half the children in the valley. Lost her own 3 babies to it one after another, over the course of 2 weeks." She pointed to specific sections of the quilt as she spoke. "Every image in here represents a child who died that summer. Sarah stitched their stories into the fabric as a way of remembering, of keeping them alive in some fashion. Took her nearly 5 years to finish it." I looked at the quilt with new understanding, seeing now that the seemingly random arrangement of figures actually told the story of a community devastated by disease. It was a memorial, a way of preserving the memory of children who might otherwise be forgotten. "It's remarkable," I said quietly. "A unique historical document. If the family isn't selling it, would they consider donating it to a museum? Something this significant should be preserved and studied." Agnes's expression grew troubled. "That's the thing, Professor. The family's not keeping it because they want to preserve it. They're keeping it because they're afraid of what might happen if someone else takes it home." Before I could ask what she meant, Agnes continued. "Sarah Morrison didn't just stitch memories into that quilt. She stitched her grief, her anger, her absolute rage at God and fate and whatever forces had taken her children. And that kind of emotion, when it's worked into something with that much dedication and skill, it tends to linger." I was intrigued despite my natural skepticism about such claims. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm saying that quilt has been nothing but trouble for the Morrison family for over a century and a half. Every time someone in the family has tried to use it to sleep under it or even display it prominently, tragedy follows. Children get sick, accidents happen, grief seems to multiply rather than fade." Agnes looked directly at me, her eyes holding the kind of seriousness that comes from first-hand knowledge. "Last person to sleep under that quilt was young Robert Morrison, back in 1987. He was the old man's grandson, visiting for the summer. They put him in the guest room with that quilt on the bed. Found him dead 3 days later. No explanation, no illness, just gone. Coroner said it was sudden heart failure, but Robert was 23 years old and healthy as a horse." I studied the quilt again, trying to reconcile Agnes's disturbing story with the beautiful craftsmanship I was observing. "And the family believes the quilt was responsible?" "The family knows it was responsible. They've been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since. Can't bring themselves to destroy something that represents so much family history. but they're terrified to keep it in the house where someone might be tempted to use it. The conversation was interrupted by other browsers entering the room, and Agnes moved away to examine other items. But I found myself unable to leave the quilt alone. The more I studied it, the more convinced I became that this was an extraordinary example of 19th century folk art that deserved scholarly attention. Over the course of the sale, I made several attempts to contact family members about examining the quilt for my research. Finally, on the last day, I was approached by a young man who introduced himself as David Morrison, the great-great-grandson of Sarah Morrison. "I understand you're interested in Aunt Sarah's quilt," he said, gesturing toward the corner where it still hung. "I've been thinking about what Agnes told you, and I have a proposition." David explained that the family had been debating what to do with the quilt for years. They were torn between preserving family history and protecting future generations from what they genuinely believed was a dangerous object. "If you're willing to take responsibility for it, to study it, and maybe help us understand what makes it so problematic, we'd be willing to let you borrow it for your research, with the understanding that if anything strange happens, you bring it back immediately." I agreed without hesitation, seeing this as an unprecedented opportunity to study a unique piece of folk art with documented provenance and detailed family history. I transported the quilt to my home in Beckley with great care, treating it with the respect due a museum-quality artifact. I set up a spare bedroom as a temporary study space, hanging the quilt where I could examine it under proper lighting while photographing and documenting every detail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Sarah Morrison had been a master quilter, and every stitch showed the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. But more than technical skill, the quilt radiated emotional intensity. The longer I spent studying it, the more I could feel the grief and anger that Agnes had described. It was during my second week of research that I began to understand what the Morrison family had been afraid of. I started having dreams about the children depicted in the quilt. Not pleasant dreams of childhood innocence, but nightmares filled with fever and suffering, with mothers weeping over small graves, with the kind of devastating loss that can break minds and souls. But these weren't my dreams. They were Sarah Morrison's memories, somehow preserved in the fabric and thread of her memorial quilt. Through her stitches, she had captured not just the visual record of the fever outbreak, but the emotional experience of living through it. As my research continued, the dreams intensified. I began to wake exhausted, having spent my sleeping hours experiencing Sarah's grief as if it were my own. The weight of losing 3 children, of watching an entire community's future disappear to disease, settled into my consciousness like a physical burden. My work suffered. My relationships deteriorated. I found myself unable to concentrate on anything but the quilt and the story it told, obsessed with understanding every detail of the tragedy it memorialized. It was during my 3rd week that I made the decision to sleep under the quilt. I told myself it was for research purposes, that experiencing its effects more directly might help me understand the psychological impact it had on the Morrison family. But truthfully, I was being drawn to it by forces I didn't entirely understand, compelled to complete some connection that had been building since I first examined it. That night, covered by Sarah Morrison's grief made manifest in fabric, I didn't just dream about the fever outbreak. I lived it. I was Sarah, watching my children waste away despite every remedy I could attempt. I felt the helplessness of a mother who could do nothing to save the people she loved most. I experienced the rage at a world that would take innocent children while leaving the guilty untouched. But I also felt something else. A hunger. A need for the grief to be shared, for others to understand the magnitude of the loss, to carry some of the emotional burden that had become too great for one person to bear alone. The quilt wasn't just preserving Sarah's memories. It was spreading them, infecting anyone who came into close contact with it with the same overwhelming grief and rage that had consumed her during its creation. I woke the next morning changed. The world looked different, through eyes that had witnessed such devastating loss. Colors seemed muted, joy felt hollow, and I found myself unable to see children without thinking of all the ways they could be taken from those who loved them. Over the following days, the effect intensified. I stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining my normal routines, stopped caring about anything that seemed trivial compared to the monumental tragedy I had witnessed through Sarah's experience. I began to understand why Robert Morrison had died. The quilt didn't just share Sarah's grief, it demanded that others carry it with the same intensity that had driven her to create the memorial in the first place, and not everyone has the emotional strength to bear that kind of psychological weight. It was only when I noticed myself starting to plan my own memorial quilt, documenting losses and tragedies I had witnessed throughout my life, that I realized how dangerous my situation had become. The grief was multiplying, growing beyond Sarah's original tragedy to encompass every sorrow I had ever experienced or observed. I contacted David Morrison that same day and arranged to return the quilt immediately. "It got to you too, didn't it?" he said when he saw my condition. "You look like someone who's been carrying the world's sorrows." I helped him carefully package the quilt for storage, understanding now why the family had been so conflicted about its fate. It was genuinely a remarkable historical artifact, but it was also genuinely dangerous to anyone who spent extended time in its presence. "What will you do with it now?" I asked as we sealed the container. David sighed heavily. "We've been thinking about donating it to the State Museum with full documentation of its history and effects. Let them decide how to handle it. At least then it would be preserved for research, but kept away from anyone who might be tempted to use it as an actual quilt." I agreed that was probably the best solution, though I still felt conflicted about my brief time with it. Despite the psychological toll, it had been an extraordinary experience, offering insights into 19th century life and loss that no conventional historical document could provide. But some insights come at too high a price. Some historical artifacts carry emotional residues that are too powerful for modern people to safely handle. And some memorials preserve not just memory, but the psychological state of those who created them. I returned to my normal research, focusing on safer aspects of Appalachian material culture, but sometimes, particularly on rainy nights when grief feels closer to the surface, I think about Sarah Morrison and her quilt. I wonder if creating it helped her process her loss, or if it simply trapped her forever in the darkest moment of her life. And I remember that in these mountains where traditions run deep and emotions run deeper, the objects we create to remember our experiences sometimes remember us back, carrying forward not just the facts of our lives, but the feelings that shaped them. The quilt rests now in climate-controlled storage at the State Museum, carefully preserved but kept away from casual contact. Its catalog entry includes detailed warnings about its psychological effects, ensuring that future researchers will be prepared for what they might encounter. But I know that somewhere in those carefully stitched images, Sarah Morrison's grief continues to wait, ready to share its burden with anyone willing to understand the true cost of love and loss in a world where death comes too early and too often for those who have learned to care too much. Story 8. The Keepsake Box. This final story is the hardest for me to tell, not because it's the most frightening, but because it forced me to confront the truth about who I am and what I've become. My name is Benjamin, and I'm the reason these stories exist. I'm the collector, the one who has been gathering these cursed objects throughout the Appalachian region for the past 7 years. I thought I was preserving them, protecting innocent people from their influence. I was wrong about everything. I never intended to become a collector of supernatural artifacts. I was a perfectly ordinary insurance investigator, specializing in unusual claims in rural areas where strange things happened more often than statisticians would predict. My job was to determine whether claims were legitimate or fraudulent, and I had a reputation for being thorough, skeptical, and rational in my assessments. It was during a case involving a house fire in Somerville that I first encountered something that defied rational explanation. The homeowner claimed that an antique mirror had somehow caused the fire, that reflections in the glass had moved independently, and that flames had actually emerged from the mirror's surface to ignite the curtains. Standard procedure would have been to reject the claim as either insurance fraud or the desperate attempt of someone to blame their own negligence on supernatural causes. But something about the homeowner's sincerity, combined with physical evidence that didn't quite match the expected patterns of accidental fires, made me investigate more thoroughly. What I discovered was that the mirror had a documented history of causing fires in previous homes, that it had been sold and resold multiple times over the past century, and that each time it changed hands, it left behind a trail of destruction and tragedy. I should have simply documented this information and moved on to the next case. Instead, I found myself purchasing the mirror from the insurance company after they settled the claim, telling myself I was preventing it from causing further harm. That was my first mistake. The mirror now sits in my basement, carefully covered, and facing the wall, but its presence changed something fundamental about my relationship with the supernatural. I began to notice things I had previously dismissed as imagination or coincidence. I started paying closer attention to claims involving allegedly cursed objects, and I discovered that such items appeared throughout the Appalachian region with surprising frequency. Over the next 2 years, I acquired 6 more objects through various means. Sometimes I purchased them from insurance settlements. Other times I convinced their owners to sell them after explaining the danger they posed. I told myself I was performing a public service, gathering these dangerous artifacts where they could be contained and studied, rather than left to harm innocent people. But collecting supernatural objects changes you in ways I didn't anticipate. Each item brought its own influence into my life. The mirror showed me reflections of events that hadn't happened yet. A music box played melodies that could induce prophetic dreams. A walking stick allowed me to sense the emotional history of places I visited. A dinner plate revealed the final meals of everyone who had ever eaten from it, along with their fates. Gradually, I realized I was developing abilities that went far beyond normal human perception. I could sense when objects carried supernatural properties, could feel the weight of their histories and the nature of their influences. What had started as an insurance investigator's natural skepticism had evolved into something approaching supernatural expertise. That's when I began actively seeking out cursed objects rather than simply encountering them through my work. I developed a network of contacts throughout the mountain communities, antique dealers, estate sale organizers, family members desperate to rid themselves of troublesome heirlooms. Word spread quietly that there was someone willing to pay fair prices for items with unusual histories, no questions asked. My collection grew rapidly. By my 5th year of collecting, I had nearly 40 objects stored in my converted basement, each one carefully cataloged and contained according to its specific properties and dangers. I had convinced myself that I was performing essential work, that these items needed to be gathered and controlled by someone who understood their nature. But objects with supernatural properties don't simply sit passively in storage. They influence their environment, they interact with each other, and they gradually transform anyone who spends significant time in their presence. I began to change in ways that went beyond the development of psychic abilities. My appearance altered subtly. My hair darkened despite my advancing age, my eyes took on an intensity that made people uncomfortable, and my skin developed a texture that seemed older and younger simultaneously. More disturbing was the growing sense that I was no longer entirely human, that prolonged exposure to supernatural energies was rewriting my fundamental nature. It was during my 6th year of collecting that I discovered the true purpose of my obsession. I had acquired a wooden box, carved with intricate symbols and lined with what appeared to be silk that shimmered with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The previous owner, an elderly woman in Beckley, claimed it had belonged to her grandmother, who had used it to store important memories. The box was unlike anything in my collection. Rather than radiating a specific supernatural influence, it seemed to absorb energy from its surroundings, drawing power from the other artifacts in my basement like a spiritual battery, charging itself from multiple sources. When I opened it for the first time, I found it contained a collection of small objects: a child's tooth, a lock of hair, a wedding ring, a few coins. Items that appeared mundane but carried enormous emotional weight. But more importantly, I found a journal written in a hand I somehow recognized despite never having seen it before. The journal belonged to my great-great-grandmother, a woman named Constance who had lived in these mountains in the 1890s. Her entries described a calling she had felt to gather objects that carried the weight of human experience, items that held memories and emotions too powerful to be lost when their original owners died. As I read her words, I realized with growing horror that my collecting wasn't a choice I had made. It was a family obligation, a hereditary compulsion that had been passed down through generations. The supernatural abilities I had developed weren't the result of exposure to cursed objects. They were inherited traits that had been dormant until activated by contact with my true purpose. I was the latest in a line of collectors, each generation, responsible for gathering and preserving supernatural artifacts until they could be passed on to the next guardian. What I had thought was my own decision to protect people from dangerous objects was actually an ancient duty that had been bred into my bloodline. But the most disturbing revelation came in the journal's final entries. Constance wrote about the true purpose of the collection, about what happened when enough supernatural objects were gathered in one place by someone with the proper bloodline and abilities. The collection wasn't meant to be stored indefinitely. It was meant to be activated. All the cursed objects I had gathered, all the supernatural artifacts I had carefully cataloged and contained, were components in a larger working. When brought together in sufficient number and properly arranged, they would create something unprecedented, a focal point for supernatural energy that could reshape reality according to the will of whoever controlled it. And I was apparently the key to that activation. Reading Constance's journal triggered the final stage of my transformation. The scattered supernatural influences I had absorbed over years of collecting began to coalesce into something coherent and terrifying. I could feel the power of every object in my basement, understand their individual properties and how they would function as part of a greater whole. More disturbing was the realization that this had always been my destiny. Every case I had investigated, every object I had encountered, every decision that had led me to this moment, all of it had been orchestrated by forces beyond my understanding to bring me to this point of activation. I tried to resist. I attempted to sell the collection, to scatter the objects across multiple locations, to break whatever pattern was building toward completion. But the supernatural forces that had guided my life for so long would not be denied so easily. Objects I sold found their way back to me through seemingly random circumstances. Items I tried to destroy proved indestructible or regenerated themselves overnight. People I attempted to warn about the dangers of my collection either couldn't remember our conversations or became convinced that I was the rightful guardian of these artifacts. The keepsake box that had revealed my true nature also provided the method for completing my transformation. Inside its silk-lined interior, I found instructions for arranging the collected objects in a specific pattern that would unlock their combined power. I knew I shouldn't follow those instructions. I understood that activating the collection would make me something beyond human, would give me abilities that no one person should possess. But the compulsion was too strong, the hereditary drive too powerful to resist. On a rainy night in October, exactly 7 years after I had first encountered the supernatural mirror, I arranged my collection according to the pattern described in Constance's journal. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Every cursed object I had gathered discharged its accumulated power simultaneously, flooding me with supernatural energy that rewrote my fundamental nature. I became a conduit for forces that exist beyond normal reality, a focal point where the supernatural bleeds through into the ordinary world. But with that power came understanding. I finally comprehended the true scope of what I'd become part of. The collection wasn't just about gathering dangerous objects. It was about preserving human experiences that were too intense, too meaningful, too supernaturally charged to be lost when their original context ended. Every cursed object in my basement represented someone's encounter with forces beyond normal understanding. The music box that trapped dancing souls, the photograph that collected family spirits, the garden gnome that transformed gardeners into something more than human. All of them were preserving experiences that would otherwise be lost when their witnesses died. I had become the custodian of supernatural memory, the keeper of encounters that existed at the boundary between normal life and otherworldly influence. My role wasn't to contain or destroy these objects, but to ensure their stories were told, their experiences shared, their warnings passed on to those who might encounter similar phenomena. That's why I'm telling you these stories now. Not as entertainment, not as fiction, but as genuine warnings about the supernatural forces that exist throughout these Appalachian mountains. Each tale represents a real encounter with objects that carry genuine power, real people who were transformed by contact with forces beyond their understanding. The objects themselves remain in my collection, safely contained but still active, still carrying the experiences of those who encountered them, and I remain their guardian, no longer entirely human but not yet something else, serving as the bridge between the supernatural and ordinary worlds. So when you encounter objects that seem too beautiful, too perfect, too emotionally resonant, to be merely mundane, when you find yourself drawn to items with unknown histories and inexplicable appeal, remember these stories. Remember that in these ancient mountains where traditions run deep and mysteries run deeper, some treasures come with prices that can't be calculated until it's too late to change your mind. Thank you for listening to these tales from the boundary between worlds. If you found them meaningful, if they've made you question what's real and what's possible, please support Dr. Bonechill by subscribing and sharing these stories with others who need to understand what exists in the shadows of our ordinary lives, because the supernatural is always closer than we think, always ready to reveal itself to those who are prepared to see beyond the veil of normal reality. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply bear witness to the experiences of those who have crossed that boundary and return to tell their stories. The collection continues to grow, and I continue to serve as its guardian, gathering the supernatural artifacts that appear throughout these mountains and preserving the stories of those who encounter them. Because every cursed object represents someone's life forever changed, and those changes deserve to be remembered, understood, and shared as warnings for those who might follow the same paths. Until next time, stay safe in the shadows. And remember, in Appalachia, the rain never just washes things clean. Sometimes it reveals what was always hiding beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to change your life forever.